Chapter 2. We closed up at 6 that evening. I pulled a gift-wrapped box out of my desk drawer and handed it to Marty before turning out the lights. Sil, you didn't have to get me anything. Don't make a big deal. It's Christmas, for goodness sakes. Everybody needs a gift. I watched him blush. Let's get out of here. You got plans? Midnight Mass is on tap if you're free, I said, grabbing my umbrella. I do have plans, but thanks. Probably a lie, but I let it go. As we headed down the narrow staircase, Martin fired off a series of questions about Carson Stark. Do you think he did it? What do you think the cops will say about you taking the case? What do you want me to do? At the bottom of the staircase, I turned to face him, remaining silent. My first inclination was to snap and tell him to settle down, but then I remembered how much I owed him. He had given me a purpose, and for that I was eternally grateful. I adjusted my features, softening my hardened frown. Recognizing the look that said, "Slow down, pace yourself," Martin nodded gently. I unfurled my umbrella and opened it before stepping out into the rain. Want a ride? Martin asked. No thanks, I'll walk. Sylvia, it's a downpour out here. I know, that's why I want to walk. Merry Christmas. I blew him a kiss and headed for the crosswalk. Living 5 blocks from the office made it nearly impossible to drive, even when the weather was miserable. As Martin pulled away, the chilled rain began to turn into sleet, and the slosh of my boots in the cold puddles increased my feelings of loneliness and regret. The meeting with Carson Stark had pushed me deeper into a somber mood. There's something depressing about spending the holiday alone in a place where you should know people. The opposite is true of an out-of-town Christmas vacation, and I wondered again why I hadn't booked a flight. I'd spent the previous Christmas in Quebec City, sipping ice wine and nibbling on poutine, in a cozy bed and breakfast. During my week-long stay in the old section of the city, I'd made temporary friends with random strangers and meandered along the frigid, snow-covered cobblestone streets. The companionship of the strangers I met was too short to sour, but long enough to satiate the need for human contact. I'd returned after New Year's Day, feeling refreshed and ready to get back to my world of all work and no play. I was born and raised in Detroit and had spent most of my life in southeastern Michigan. My parents, who still lived in Detroit, tolerated a few visits a year, but we had not been close for a very long time. At 10 years old, my twin brother Simon had disappeared one day when we were playing at the edge of the dead-end street adjacent to our house. The loss of Simon had destroyed our family, causing me to seek refuge somewhere far away from my parents. I'd attended a boarding school in Connecticut as a teenager, but something had drawn me back to Michigan for college. Ironically, Michigan is the place where I feel most alone. My haunted past had followed me around the state. During my time in Connecticut, I'd been free of the guilt of being the twin that hadn't been abducted, but returning to Michigan had rekindled painful memories of my brother's absence. Currently, I live in Ypsilanti, a little college town about 40 minutes from Detroit. Ypsilanti is a historic district meets the ghetto with a crosshatch of college life. The town is sandwiched in between Ann Arbor and Superior Township in Washtenaw County, and it serves as a cheaper option for those who want to live close to the culture and beauty of the Ann Arbor area. I moved to Ypsi for graduate school and fell in love with the place. It has a Midwest swagger with a hint of Southern hospitality and an edge of danger. If you get a flat tire, someone will stop and help you change it. But if you leave your front door unlocked, someone might come in and maybe take a thing or two. People speak to each other when they walk down the street, and hippies, scholars, students, and drug dealers manage to commingle without much friction. Shuddering underneath the umbrella, I felt the chill of isolation. The street was quiet and calm, but the glow of windows, warm with Christmas Eve cheer, filled my peripheral vision. I should have invited Martin over for a drink, but there was a part of me that didn't want company. The loss of Derek reminded me that some parts of life were dark. There was no way to eliminate them. Accepting that fact had helped me deal with the sorrow. Instead of thinking it would end or that I needed to fight against the pain, I accepted that most days would be no better or worse than the previous day. Derek would always be in the corner of my mind, silent but ever present. I have learned that staying busy and productive is a great way to repress loneliness. But there are times when busyness fails to distract from the truth. Even so, I was going to do my best to let this new case consume me. As soon as I stuck my key in the front door, I began to organize a plan of action to find out who killed Liza Stark. I headed to the kitchen, brought a pot of water to boil, and tossed in half a box of linguine. In a second pot, I mixed Parmesan and cream cheese to make a simple but adequate Alfredo sauce. I poured myself a glass of Riesling and tossed the pasta and sauce together once everything was done. Then I sat down at the long wooden table for a silent dinner. After that, I sighed and faced reality. The night was not over yet, so I had better start getting myself in order. Midnight Mass was the last place I wanted to go, but since it was Christmas Eve, it would be a stop along my lonely Christmas journey. There was nothing quite like Midnight Mass, but you don't remember that until you walk through the doors of the church. The inclination to curl up with hot cocoa and watch It's a Wonderful Life always tempts me to stay home, but once I arrive at church, I remember why I go every year. I'm drawn by the smell of frankincense and myrrh weaving through the air, the flickering flames of the candles lit in oblation, and the collective warmth of the people in the overcrowded church, many of whom have not been to Mass since Easter or the previous Christmas Eve. I never want to go until I get there, but I never acknowledge that truth until I arrive. I took a shower before slipping on a cardigan, a long pleated black skirt, and boots. As I waited for the clock to move closer to midnight, I started to review the preliminary questions that preface all murder investigations. Who wanted Liza Stark dead? Who had the means to kill her? The issue of who wanted Liza Stark dead was important, but not as important as how she ended up being vulnerable to murder. Some people aren't likable, or they make enemies along the way. There might be a few people who would like to see them dead, but very few enemies are going to act on that impulse. Also, a complete and total stranger can kill you if you end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. So there was a chance that Liza's murder was purely coincidental. She was in one of the worst neighborhoods in the country. Getting murdered in Brightmoor was easy, but being in Brightmoor was not. So the first question was, how did she end up in a time and a place that allowed her to be killed? Since it was Christmas Eve, there was little research that could be done. I wrote my 3 essential questions on a piece of paper, took it to my home office, placed it on the desk, and forced myself to close the door. Life is more than work, I told myself. The snow continued to fall throughout the evening. At 11:45, I reluctantly headed out into the bitter, wet cold. I arrived at the church moments before the procession began. Just about every seat was taken, and the air was full of incense. Warmth emitted from the packed pews. I slithered into a small space on one of the back pews next to a family of 6. The toddler was bouncing on his mother's knee and squealing with delight. I flipped down the kneeler and said a few prayers before the music for the procession began. Christmas Day dawned with a cold, empty silence that left me distracted and aloof. A light, wispy snow was falling, and the temperature continued to drop throughout the day. I skipped my run that morning and curled up on the couch with a cup of tea. The rest of the day was spent alternating between my bed and a tattered beige recliner in the sitting room. In the evening, I felt restless and decided to watch a movie. After 30 minutes of a sappy story about international house swapping and falling in love, I stole one last look at Jude Law and turned off the television. Time to do something constructive. Being a PI is difficult because you're in law enforcement, but you don't have the perks that regular cops do. I have access to public domain information on the internet, but I can't just tap into a database and pull up interesting tidbits about a victim. Instead, I must find evidence the old-fashioned and least reliable way, by talking to people. I didn't think anyone would appreciate me interrupting their Christmas dinner to ask questions about a homicide, so I decided to do the cyber sleuth thing. The first question about the case: what the hell was Liza Stark doing in Detroit? Southeastern Michigan has two very simple rules: know your place and stay there. Liza Stark was a white female from the suburbs and not one of the blue collar United Auto Worker suburbs. There was really no legitimate reason for her to have been in the Brightmoor district of Detroit. There aren't many businesses in that area except for churches and liquor stores, and even those are sparse. It's a safe assumption that people who live in Brightmoor stay in the area and rarely, if ever, venture out of the neighborhood. Someone living in Brightmoor wouldn't end up in Northfield Township, an upper middle class suburb that is light years away from most neighborhoods in Detroit. Someone living in Northfield Township might end up in Brightmoor if they were searching for something like drugs, which they'd have trouble getting in their neighborhood. Even so, they would have to know someone in Brightmoor. Who did Liza know in that area? How would she have met them? Initially, I thought the drugs might have beckoned Liza below 8 Mile Road, but an article posted a few months after her killing said that an autopsy showed she didn't have any drugs in her system. Carson Stark had already told me about the second theory. Liza was a desperate housewife looking for a thrill with some young have-not. The third one, of course, was that Carson himself had murdered his wife. None of those theories really pushed the bright buttons for me, but I thought that the infidelity angle was worth looking at. It is possible to be madly in love with someone who likes you enough to stay, but who has no problem lying to you. The tears and anguish Carson Stark had showed had seemed real, but who was to say that the Liza he knew was the only one that existed? Maybe there was some drug-dealing, stolen car-wheeling guy who had satisfied Liza's primal urges. Humans are capable of a high level of deceit. Liza could have gotten herself into a deadly affair. Perhaps her lower-class beau had demanded money and she had refused. Before the night was over, I had some basic facts about Liza. She'd attended Stevenson High School in Livonia, but no graduation date was listed. She'd also spent 2 years at Schoolcraft College, but never completed a degree or certificate. At the time of her murder, she was 34 years old and a stay-at-home mom. By all accounts, just your average suburban wife. Her life before marrying Carson was a little less certain. From what I could find online, her work record had been spotty. She'd been a certified nursing assistant for a while and a substitute teacher, but neither career had lasted long. She'd taken classes in early education in college, but they hadn't amounted to much. Some people take time off between high school and college for jobs or to travel, but Liza did not seem to be part of the working world until she was 22. That seemed odd, but not completely out of the question. Perhaps she'd been living with her parents at the time. I ran Liza's name through the online white pages and found addresses in Livonia, New Orleans, Louisiana, Northfield, and Detroit. The dates indicated that she had lived in Livonia as a child, in Detroit as a teenager, and in Louisiana and Northfield during her adult life. It was strange that she lived in Detroit at all, and it was even odder that she'd lived there as a teenager. But virtual white pages are notoriously inaccurate. The listing probably had another woman with the same name mixed up with Liza's address results. I also checked Liza's social media pages, but there wasn't much to see. Perhaps she had made sure to keep the security on her Facebook page tight, and strangers were not able to view the bulk of her information. I couldn't be sure, but her list of friends was rather sparse. Her page had a picture of Carson and the kids, minus herself, and she had 29 friends. She hadn't posted anything since 2009, 2 years before she was murdered. Of course, social media had just been picking up steam around that time, so it wasn't too strange that she didn't have much information. But it did pique my interest. Posting on social media and having quote-unquote friends is by no means a sign of normalcy. But for a stay-at-home mom in a posh suburb, it would be a great way to boast and possibly brag about your world. She was beautiful, married to a doctor, had 2 kids, a phenomenal zip code, all the surface things that people think produce happiness. Of course, I know from experience that the more people you include in your life, the more difficult it is to be happy. Perhaps Liza had come to a similar conclusion and decided to keep her life private. Or maybe she turned to an outside source as some type of release. I scrolled I scrolled through the few posts on Liza's page and found minimal, very guarded information. There were no thuggish looking folks on her friends list. Next, I checked a newspaper website for articles on the murder. I read a short summary of the crime and a few statements from one of the detectives on the case, Kevin Cole. After a few hours of scouring the internet, my vision was blurred from too much time in front of the computer. I closed the laptop, grabbed my phone, and called Martin. She was hiding something, I said as soon as he picked up the phone. Why do you think that? Oh, and Merry Christmas, Martin said. I could hear the muffled sound of a video game in the background. Her social media pages are sparse. There's one single solitary photo of her. The rest are of her family, but none of those photos have her in them. She's never with the family because she's different. How's she different? I don't know, I said, but she's different from them. The noise in the background stopped. Tomorrow I will set up appointments with Carson, her best friend Madeline, and the store owner. I want to see where Eliza lived. After the holiday break, contact her former coworkers. She taught at St. Bart's for a year. Talk to the principal and any teachers who worked with her. I'll also call the 8th precinct and get in there to see the case file. You think that Liza did something to get herself killed? Martin asked. I think that there's something her husband doesn't know that contributed to her murder. I know how it is to have secrets.